Welcome to today's Green Chemistry and Commerce Council Mainstreaming Green Chemistry webinar series entitled The GC3's Agenda to Mainstream Green Chemistry, What It Says and What It Means in Practice. We'll be beginning the webinar in just a minute. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Green Chemistry and Commerce Council webinar entitled The GC3's Agenda to Mainstream Green Chemistry, What It Says and What It Means in Practice. My name is Joel Tickner, and I'm the Director of the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. For those of you who are not familiar with the GC3 or the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, the GC3 is a business membership organization working collaboratively to accelerate the application of green chemistry across sectors and supply chains. Its mission is to make green chemistry standard practice in industry for innovation, public health, and environmental protection. The GC3 now consists of more than 85 members, ranging from major retailers to brands, major chemical companies, and processors and suppliers in between along the whole supply chain and across multiple sectors, in addition to other stakeholders, including those in government and the nonprofit sector. If you're not already a member of the GC3, we invite you to join the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council by going to our website, www.greenchemistryandcommerce.org. Today's webinar focuses on the GC3's Agenda to Mainstream Green Chemistry. In 2014, the GC3's Advisory Committee set forward a broad goal of, within 5 years, making significant progress to mainstream or accelerate the green chemistry, to get to a point where all chemistry is, by definition, green chemistry. What we've seen in the work we've done in background on mainstreaming green chemistry is that during the past 10 years, there's been a significant increase in demands for safer chemicals and products. We've seen an exceptional growth of green chemistry research, education, awards programs such as the Presidential Green Chemistry Awards, and in the last 5 years, incredible growth in collaborations between and within sectors and within supply chains, all of those focused on advancing safer, more sustainable chemicals and products, to advance green chemistry research and to advance green chemistry education. We've been extremely successful in elevating the importance of green chemistry, and there's an increasing number of green chemistry success stories, but it's still a niche consideration. We've made great successes in programs, collaborations, and recognition of need, but green chemistry is still a marginal consideration in academia, in government programs, and in funding structures for example, clean technology. What we found is that the green chemistry community today lacks a coherent long-term strategy, strong coordination, and stable and significant funding. So to do that, we need to move green chemistry into the fabric of education, research and development, government programs, and the chemical enterprise. So we've made great progress on the demand side for green chemistry solutions, but the supply side hasn't kept pace with those demands. So in working our GC3 agenda to mainstream green chemistry, we did significant research on what are the barriers and drivers for green chemistry, to understand what are the needs, where have we been, and where do we need to go. So the GC3 agenda to mainstream green chemistry is based on research, collaborative initiatives, and dialogue to outline a strategic path forward to accelerate research and adoption of green chemistry. In developing the agenda, we set 3 short-term goals. 1, to scale green chemistry and innovation. 2, to elevate the importance of green chemistry in education and research. And then 3rd, to develop and pass smart policies that support markets, research, and innovation in green chemistry. So moving forward, and why we're holding this webinar today, is we believe that this is a unique time to accelerate the growth of green chemistry. There are many parts in place to move this and make it happen, but this requires a vision, leadership, resources, and what is important to the GC3 is a collaboration across sectors and stakeholder groups, including government, industrial, and academic collaboration. So for the GC3, this agenda creates an imperative for action by putting in one place an explanation of what is green chemistry, what are its benefits, what are the barriers and drivers for green chemistry, what are the strategies to overcome those barriers, and what are some strategic actions that the GC3 will take during the next 5 years to accelerate the growth of green chemistry. We hope that this agenda can be used by a variety of stakeholder groups, for example, government, and that's what we'll be discussing today, is how this agenda can be used and its importance. Government is a roadmap for developing national strategy, a framework for the national strategy, and the GC3 just hosted with the ACS and the American Sustainable Business Council a briefing in Washington where with Senator Coons from Delaware, who has put in place language to create a national advisory committee around sustainable chemistry. We hope that companies will use this agenda to guide research and development strategy and their stakeholder engagement. We hope that researchers and educators will use the agenda to advocate for increased funding for the establishment of academic programs and to link more closely with businesses and societal need for green chemistry solutions. And lastly, we hope that advocates will take this agenda to use it in their prioritization of the importance of leadership and funding for solutions, not just campaigning for addressing chemicals of concern. So today's speakers, we have a great group of speakers who will describe the agenda and then the importance and how this agenda can be used moving forward. Amy Perlmutter is a GC3 Senior Fellow and is Principal of Perlmutter Associates. She's worked for decades in the recycling industry and in combining recycling and economic development. Bob Israel is the Vice President for Stewardship and Sustainability at the Valspar Corporation, where he has 30 years of experience in product stewardship, regulatory affairs, and corporate sustainability strategy. He's a chemist who has worked in numerous industry and government positions, including Diversey Corporation, and at the US EPA, where he was instrumental in starting efforts around green chemistry at the agency. Babette Pettersen is the Chief Commercial Officer at BioAmber, a market leader in bio-based succinic acid and a pioneer in renewable chemicals. Babette was previously VP of New Business Development for Performance Materials at Royal DSM and was also at Dow Corning and Baxter in previous positions. Due to the number of participants in the webinar today, all lines will be muted, and if you have a question or comment, please type them in the question and answer box located in the drop-down menu at the top of your screen. At the end of the presentations, we'll be answering questions as they come into the Q&A box. And with that, I would like to present Amy Perlmutter, who has led the GC3's mainstreaming green chemistry effort and will be discussing the mainstreaming green chemistry agenda. Amy, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Joel, and hello to everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. So I'm going to, as Joel said, talk about the GC3's Agenda to Mainstream Green Chemistry. This is the cover of the document. We just released it at the end of the year, and we're very excited about it. And as Joel said, it lays out strategies for how we can take green chemistry to mainstream. So we had 3 goals in developing this agenda. One was to scale green chemistry innovation. The other is to elevate the importance of green chemistry in education and research. And the third is to develop and pass smart policies that support markets, research, and innovation. So the process that we use to create the agenda is literature review. A lot has already been written about barriers and drivers and needs, and so we reviewed a lot of that literature. We did an original survey of our members, our business members, to find out what drives them, what their barriers are, and what their needs are. We did original research looking at making the business case. True Cost did that report for us along with the American Sustainable Business Council. We, Tess Fennelly and Associates, did some research for us, digging deeper into the issue of barriers. And Ann Blake did a landscape analysis on metrics. What are the kinds of metrics we can use to make sure that we're moving in the right direction in green chemistry? We also, over the course of the years, we've gotten a lot of input at the GC3's annual roundtable, and we worked with an advisory committee as well that helped shape this. And this is who our advisory committee was. It was a coalition of researchers, of business leaders, of government leaders, and of advocates, all providing input on the plan, on this agenda. So just briefly, I'm not going to walk through the entire agenda, but I'm just going to touch on some key parts of it. But this is what it includes. So we have an overview. We have why do we need an agenda to mainstream green chemistry? So that includes an overview of green chemistry and of the growth of green chemistry and why it's important and should become mainstream. And again, as Joel said, we define mainstreaming of green chemistry as when all chemistry is green chemistry, so we don't even have to call it green chemistry anymore. It's just chemistry. We have a definition of green chemistry. We talk about how green chemistry is practiced. We describe its growth over the years. We make the business case for it and discuss drivers and barriers. And then we also have 5 key strategies. So again, based on all this input, it seemed to us that there were 5 ways that we can really move green chemistry forward. And then we have actions that the GC3 itself will take to move green chemistry forward. So defining green chemistry. We define green chemistry as the design of chemical products or processes that reduce or eliminate the use and generation of hazardous substances throughout their life cycle. It uses the 12 principles of green chemistry that were laid out by Warner and Anastas. While green chemistry does happen at the molecular design level, product developers, manufacturers, retailers, and brands all play an important role in its implementation. And they do this by changing design specifications, by sourcing materials and products that incorporate green chemistry practices, by changing their own manufacturing practices to substitute or reduce the use of hazardous chemicals, and developing and implementing policies that restrict chemicals of concern in the products they source, make, or sell. And green chemistry can be an iterative process where we're talking about incremental change and continuous improvement, or it can be a disruptive innovation that completely changes the way things are done. So what are the drivers of green chemistry? And this is a table from the agenda, and this is how the GC3 members that we surveyed, these are the top things that they ranked. And you can see there's some differences among different sectors, but one of the top 2 issues actually that were ranked by everybody were concern for worker health and safety and concern for the environment. In additional research that Tess Fennelly did on drivers, consumer demand was way up there, and you'll see that that's part of our chart as well. But one of the other things that is a driver is well-designed government policies, and we did not ask that as part of our survey, but research has shown that well-designed government policies can also be effective drivers. 30% of companies that received the Presidential Green Chemistry Awards stated that regulations were one of their drivers, and a survey that was done of international chemists working internationally by the Yale Center for Green Chemistry and Green Engineering, the London School of Economics and Political Science, and the OECD Environment Directorate also found that government regulation is a big driver in decisions to invest in research and development in green chemistry. So those are some of the drivers. And then we look at barriers, and there are lots of barriers, and they fall into 4 categories, or we divided them into 4 categories. So the first one is development, identification, and evaluation of green chemistry innovations, and that includes a long time frame to research, develop, and scale up safer alternatives, the perceived lack of value in green chemistry, lack of information to assess chemical hazards, etc. Then we've got supply chain alignment, and that includes the lack of technically or economically feasible safer alternatives, the perceived high cost of alternatives, the lack of transparency in supply chains, the incumbency of existing chemicals in markets. Once you've got something that's well known in the marketplace, it's understandably hard to get a new substitution in there or a new technology. The risks of switching are not shared across the supply chain, and more. Education is one of the other barriers to green chemistry, that we don't have enough chemists and chemical engineers who are trained in green chemistry. And part of that is because of the inertia and incumbency of traditional green chemistry education. And then metrics. We have a lack of agreement of what should be counted as green chemistry. If you're only following one of the 12 principles, are you implementing green chemistry? So we really need to come to an agreement on what gets counted, and then we need to figure out how to develop the data to measure the progress that will also help us make the case for the benefits of green chemistry. So in terms of changing the way chemistry is practiced and mainstreaming green chemistry, we looked at some of the actions that were recommended by our members and through these literature searches and research that we've done, and we came up with 5 key strategies is how we can take green chemistry to the mainstream. And one is that we need to enhance market dynamics, and we do that by continuing research and dialogue among stakeholders, keeping an up-to-date understanding of the changing market factors driving and holding back green chemistry and adoption, and then using this information to grow green chemistry practice. The second strategy is to support smart policies, and we call for and will support smart state and federal policies that accelerate and enhance green chemistry innovation and adoption. And Joel talked about this a little bit, and I'll get to this again in a second. Our third strategy is to foster collaboration, and this is a role that the GC3 has played quite strongly in other groups as well, but we will support efforts that help create collaborations within and among supply chains and industry sectors, and that involve other stakeholders, so that we can grow demand, build capacity, stimulate innovation, and improve information flow. And we want to inform the marketplace, so we want to make sure that we disseminate information into the marketplace that supports green chemistry education, research, and practice. And finally, we want to track our progress. So we want to support the development and use of metrics to track and understand green chemistry benefits and progress. So in the agenda also we have what we're calling our action plan. So we want the agenda to be used by all the different parties that Joel mentioned in his introductory remarks, policymakers and researchers and businesses and activists, but we also want to stake out, what the actions that we as a GC3 are going to take. And these are short-term actions. We'll be revising our actions, each year. We'll be looking back at barriers and how we've done on our action plan and revising it and expanding it. So, but for the immediate actions right now, we came up with 6 short-term actions, and one is that we'll support the proposed Federal Sustainable Chemistry R&D Act of 2015, or similar legislation that meets the GC3's criteria of smart policies. And as part of that, Joel mentioned the congressional briefing that we had with Senator Coons for the Sustainable Chemistry R&D Act. We want to expand the development and use of innovative tools and resources to accelerate green chemistry, and we have launched and we're revamping all of our various portals. We've got our innovation portal, our retail portal, and our education toolbox, I think we're calling that. We want to convene a national summit on green chemistry education, and we'll be developing that over the next year. We want to build agreement on priority metrics needed to measure progress in green chemistry and ways to gather such metrics, and we'll be starting to work on that at our upcoming roundtable in May. We want to engage with public and private sector funding entities to target critical green chemistry needs, and we'll be working on that over the next year or two. And we want to continue to advance collaborative supply chain partnerships. And so right now we have a preservatives project underway, and we'll be developing another project to be determined. So just to show this is the way that the GC3 is framing all of these issues and thinking about this. So we're looking at our actions and how they specifically relate to the barriers and which strategies that they address. So again, as we update our action plan, we'll be framing it this way and making sure that what we're doing actually is addressing the stated barrier. So with that, we'll pass this on, but this is how we're, again, our image. And if you want to download the report, you can go to greenchemistryandcommerce.org, and you'll see the mainstreaming project there. And if you have any questions, feel free to email mainstream@greenchemistryandcommerce.org. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. Now, Bob Israel, thank you so much for being here on today's webinar. And let me note that Bob is one of the members of the GC3 Advisory Committee as well.
Thanks, Joel. And I'd also like to thank you, Joel, for the promotion you gave me on the slide that you had me listed. I think you gave me an elevated title. I appreciate it. I'll have to pass it along here. I'm glad to be a part of this today because I've participated in the whole concept of mainstreaming green chemistry with the GC3, since its inception and since we came up with the idea that this is the main agenda for the GC3. And I like to think about this in terms of what I present to you is along the lines of provoking thought, provoking hopefully big thought. Nothing I'm going to present here necessarily is groundbreaking per se, but my hope is that by thinking about these things in terms of, well, how do we actually deal with this? How do we actually action mainstreaming green chemistry, that we come up with even more ideas that build on everything that's in the agenda and think about things in a different way. I have on this title slide, how do you eat an elephant? And I think we all know the answer to that. But the case for green chemistry requires us to think that way. We're not going to be able to do it all in one fell swoop, and it's going to be a journey, just like sustainability. Let's see, I'm trying to advance my slides. There we go. So some of the realities that we have today, again, this is things that we can all relate to in many parts of the industries that we serve, wherever we are in the supply chain. Today we kind of deal with chemistry in a very combative approach, and that is to say that even when a company tries to do something good, there's somebody who says, well, that's not good enough. And that's problematic. It's problematic, and the theme that you'll hear me talk about very often is around communication. And so the stakeholders to this communicate in very different ways and not necessarily consistently. And what it does is it confuses the buyer, or it confuses the consumer. And they don't know what to believe at certain points because of this combative approach. We don't have alignment, we don't have agreement, and so that's a problem. Resistance to change. We have companies, or we have sectors within companies that, we've been doing it this way for a long time. Why do we need to change? Amy mentioned, in essence, the supply and demand cost paradigm, how that is a problem in bringing new technology in the face of the existing technology, which often not is the low-cost, non-green competitor. And so there's also then a fear within companies of coming up with something new because They know they're going up against something that has been around for a long time. That's hard enough to overcome, but now they have to deal with the cost parameters associated with the new technology as well. There are many conflicting beliefs in the application of hazard versus risk, and very often we're focused on a hazard-based criteria that are being pushed at various levels, and risk seems to be left out. Sometimes life cycle seems to be left out. Sometimes it takes over. We don't have a consistent way of applying these beneficial tools to the solutions that we want to put out there. Communication, again, is the big one. It's a big theme as far as I'm concerned in what is holding green chemistry back because of the discrepancies that we have there. So consumers don't know what to believe. Multiple green standards and specifications, the all-or-nothing approach to green and that those standards suggest. And lastly, the pull for green chemistry. This is human nature. This is the frog in the boiling water, right? So the pull for green chemistry may only happen quickly in the face of calamity. What we're trying to do is suggest that we need to recognize the frog in the boiling water and be way ahead of that. And that's what the agenda for mainstreaming green chemistry does. And now we need to think about it a little bit more broadly. So to me, the question becomes one of the various stakeholders. Who are they? And I've listed some here. This is not a complete list per se. But the important point here is, what is the role that they have to contribute to green chemistry? And do they know what that role is? We can go through any one of these to and think about and talk about it, and I'm not going to do that here for the sake of time, but this is something that I think we can all think about as we go forward in our agenda for mainstreaming green chemistry and highlight and communicate the role that each of these stakeholders and others play in the promotion of green chemistry, in the mainstreaming of green chemistry. And so again, this is something for us to think about, and we need to think about it in contrast to the way that the stakeholders might view that today. Okay, so for one example that I've hit on already, perhaps the NGO community is sometimes more combative to what the chemical manufacturers or brand owners put out there as successes. And it's because we're not communicating on the same level, our expectations are not the same, our capabilities may not be recognized in terms of how far can we go with a solution, at least today. The solutions are never easy. They're hard things to do, and I don't know that it's always well recognized throughout all the stakeholder community. So what do we need to change? Again, I think we can talk about the roles of the various stakeholders and what it would mean for them to be proactive in mainstreaming green chemistry. We need to move away from the antagonistic combative approaches. It causes consumer confusion, lack of stakeholder consensus, lack of trust, and conflicting communication. I think that's one of the things that really bogs us down in moving green chemistry along. There's the reluctance as a result of all those things. We need to move from taking out the bad to building in the good, and what this means is oftentimes we're trying to remove this chemical or remove that chemical or this bad actor, as opposed to saying, here's a new innovation, we're going to build it right from the get-go. There's no need to talk about what the bad is. Let's just build it and build it right. Build it with green chemistry. And that is part of a positive, proactive approach to problem solving. And what I'd like to suggest is that it needs to be done in a way that aligns all the stakeholders that I've mentioned early on. And so, the way I look at this is one of the things that I think is needed is there's a need for broader stakeholder collaboration, and that can happen in a number of ways. I like to call it a more holistic approach, and holistic because it considers the inputs and or desires of all the stakeholders in the process. So building in the good as part of a new innovation, having all the stakeholders at the table, or at least broadening those stakeholder relationships as we have them today. There's a lot of great stuff that's going on out there, but I think it could be built even broader than what we're seeing, and could help with things like reaching agreements on priorities. What are the green chemistry solutions that we need? How can we expedite and or incentivize green chemistry? How can we deal with the market entry dilemma, and things of that sort. Embracing continuous improvement is something that I really think could use a lot of discussion amongst the stakeholders. Too often times it's an all or nothing thing with trying to meet one person's criteria versus another, and that continuous improvement, it may require that we take steps on our way to finding ultimately a green solution. Even green chemistry, or our understanding of chemistry, is always changing. Many of us know that what was considered not an issue, non-toxic, or whatever you want to call it, 5 years ago, potentially is an issue today, because we're constantly learning. And so whether it's making stepwise progress along the way, or recognizing that we constantly have new information and are learning more about the chemicals that we use, this needs to be broadly recognized amongst all the stakeholders. It allows us to create trust. It allows us to get consensus on science, and more importantly, consensus on communication. So another way to look at this is taking all of those thoughts. There is a macro approach to this and a micro approach to this. The macro approach is sort of as a society. How do we have to look at these things, and what are the things that need to change? And on the micro side of things, we may be focused on a specific problem. We may be focused on a specific company. And so I just suggested some here. All of this is, basically for more discussion and more expansion, hopefully. We need a government framework around green chemistry that focuses not only on on a number of things, but not only on incentives, subsidies, and grants. I mean, we've talked often about the fact that there are other industries that are subsidized, and for whatever reason, typically it's an economic one. I'd like to suggest that we need something similar that focuses on it for the urgency standpoint of the fact that we're dealing with chemistry and we're putting all these things out into the environment. An education system that teaches the necessity for green chemistry and engineering. Stakeholder consensus on priorities, targets, and investments. This is all the stakeholders, not just a few. Again, broader stakeholder participation in developing those priorities at a very high macro level. What are the issues of the day in our society? Stakeholder consensus on science, specifically toxicology. Again, this goes back to the issues around, we've got all kinds of metrics for defining green or defining a certification program at one level or another. Many of them are similar. Many of them have differences. And again, what does that do when we get to the communication standpoint and communicating it to the general public and the consumer? It becomes very confusing. We need to become more acceptance of the cost, performance, and green chemistry confluence as we undertake new innovations. We typically focus on cost and performance, and we kind of, many occasions, my observations is then we then bring green chemistry into the fold once we have developed these targets. One of the things that I'm trying to do within here in Valspar is, find an approximate cost performance, but then bring in the green chemistry from the beginning. Don't worry so much about totally about the cost, because if you have that new innovation, it's going to pay for itself. If you think about it, where you only have 2 of the 3 parameters and then try to figure out how it's green, typically it's not going to work. At a micro level, again, broad stakeholder collaborations to solving specific problems, getting consensus and communication, and putting green on equal footing, as I just mentioned. And then incentives which reward innovations at various levels of interaction. So whether it be B2B, whether it be B2C, G2B, which is government to business, or G2C. Many other ways of thinking about these interactions and how can we incentivize and reward the successes that we have. And again, successes in a continuous improvement fashion. That's all I have to say at this point, except to say we all recognize this saying. We can't expect things to change if we don't change what we're doing, and that's what I'm suggesting at this point. So with that, I'd like to turn it over.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. Babette, welcome to the webinar, and thanks so much for being here today.
Well, good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're all set.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thanks, Joel, and thanks to the GC3 for all that you do to facilitate the path forward for green chemical companies like ourselves that are active in the field. It's invaluable. What I'm going to do this morning for some of you, and perhaps some from Europe who are calling in from the US, good morning to you. I'm going to share our experience over the last few years in commercializing green chemicals. I'll start with telling you a little bit about our company, a young company that you may not have heard of, because our business is sustainable chemicals. That's all we do. It's the core of our business. I'll tell you a little bit who we are and what we do, and how the GC3 and the agenda to mainstream green chemistry can help us accelerate the path to more sustainable chemicals and products through the 5 key strategies that Amy talked about a short while ago. So perhaps just to start with here, as I said earlier, we're a sustainable chemicals company, so we make chemicals sustainably using renewable resources. We were established in 2008 with technology license from the Department of Energy to produce biosuccinic acid. And we've used a business model of open innovation and partnership all the way through our existence to move fast and to work as closely as possible to leverage technology, knowledge, access to markets from our partners who are existing players in the field. So in 2010, as you see on the right-hand side here, we were able to actually build our first pilot plant through partnership with the French Agricultural Consortium. That's a very important step in the life of a young, small company because it enabled us to get material of commercial scale, of demonstration scale, into the hands of potential customers to assess the properties of the material in everyday applications. However, we knew that to get to the point that Bob just raised about new innovation will pay for itself, the question of economics, we knew that we would have to get to commercial scale to reach that point. And that required us to actually go public. We went public on the New York Stock Exchange in 2013. On Euronext at the same time, and then set about building a plant, which we did in Ontario, Canada. You see here on the right bottom hand side, which actually was up and running last year, October 2015, and has been producing since and shipping all over the world. What we do is obviously make chemicals sustainably, as I said, through industrial biotechnology, where obviously we are using sugar, actually dextrose, extracted from these renewable resources, and ultimately biomass to make the chemicals, which obviously is a very different way of doing it from the incumbents today using conventional oil-based processes. So this is the plant. As I said earlier, it's one thing to have pilot technology. It's nice to have technology, but we went rather fast through that path to actually get to commercial scale or industrial scale. 30,000 tons of succinic acid capacity is now available in this plant in Canada. So we've tried to bring together the sustainability side of it, the technology side of it, and the capacity side. Why does this matter? Obviously, we started on this path to make better chemicals, as Amy said earlier, more sustainable chemicals. But it's important to note that obviously the process by which these chemicals are made is in and of itself a better process. Our plant in Sarnia, which is a small plant, 30,000 tons, however the largest for the biosuccinic acid in the world, actually is carbon neutral, so basically no greenhouse gas emissions, and this chart, which I won't go through, tells you how much that saves in terms of these emissions, but also uses 60% less energy than an equivalent petrochemical plant. So people always think of climate change as being sort of the driver, the environment on the right, so better, cleaner, greener, but it's also been mentioned several times on the left-hand side here, consumer preferences are evolving. I think, Joel, earlier you said, you know, it's really the supply side that's the issue. I hope we've demonstrated here that we've got supply of our material, and our challenge and why we need help from the GC3 and others is really ensuring that the demand that we see with consumers for more sustainable chemicals, for more natural solutions, and for reduced environmental footprint actually gets transferred down the supply chain, the value chain for chemicals to companies like ourselves that are right at the very beginning. But point 3 here is what I found most exciting as someone who's worked in the chemical industry for many years. We didn't really expect this at the outset, but it turns out that these bio-based chemicals really offer tremendous innovation potential. So it's a new chemical intermediate, just happens to be green, happens to be cleaner and safer, and has enabled, in our case, as you can see from some of these target markets here, unexpected innovation, obviously in formulation of different products in partnerships with companies active in the field. So we've kind of progressed from more sustainable chemicals to performance with a sustainability, performance and innovation, really believing that we're creating value not just through the environmental perspective, but also through the performance and innovation that these products enable across a broad range of applications. But this slide really is the core of where we need help, or describes how we need the help from organizations like GC3, is that this is a very simplified picture, but if you imagine basically here on the left-hand side, raw material from our company, from BioAmber, being biosuccinic acid, many levels it has to go through before it can get to the consumer, and this actually doesn't even illustrate the brands, because the brands would come between the formulators and the retailer here. So the challenge we have, as I said earlier, is on the right-hand side you have the consumers with an interest, a need, a desire for more sustainable solutions. Companies like ourselves, small early stage companies, all the way to the left-hand side here, pushing these through, establishing supply, but then having quite a challenge in moving this performance, innovation, and sustainability through all these different levels of the value chain, the chemical producers, the formulators, manufacturers, brands, and retailers. And I've put Bob's company, Valspar, down here, you know, obviously who play in this path and are tremendous partners to help move things through. We also partner with companies like DuPont, Tate & Lyle Bioproducts, who are peer companies that produce bio-based chemicals, to try and accelerate the process. But this is where we need the 5 key strategies, you know, help on communicating to the market, informing the marketplace, creating awareness across the value chain, informing educators and policymakers, and obviously fostering collaboration. The GC3 has been very instrumental for us in connecting us with players across the value chain. I'm just going to end with a few examples in the real world today of success for us, although we're a young company. And this is one with Covestro, previously Biomaterial Sciences, where they've developed a completely new synthetic fabric using bio-based materials, biosuccinic acid, to develop waterborne solvent-free polyurethane dispersions for textile coatings, which have as much as 65% bio-based content. So what we find is, although we obviously only play a role, a part of a role in the formulation, as companies, partners, customers think about improving the safety and the sustainability of their formulations, it encourages, as you can see here, not just bio-based, but also waterborne and solvent-free. And this slide really is just to illustrate that that benefit translates into performance. So whether it's on the left-hand side, high peeling strength in sports footwear, in the middle, whether it's soft handle for fashion garments, or on the right-hand side here, embossable materials for fashion accessories like bags, what this says is you can move to more sustainable chemicals and get the performance and innovate. and that's probably a detail I won't go through. So really just to say thank you to the GC3, thank you for your attention. These are the kinds of things here in black that we work with the GC3 and the agenda to help us move across that value chain and bring these bio-based chemicals to the market, as that example I just shared there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Babette, and thank you, Bob and Amy, for your very helpful presentations, and then Babette and Bob for providing context around the GC3 agenda. Now is time for question and answer. If you have particular questions for our panelists, you can insert them in the question and answer box on your screen. It's on the right side of your screen. I'll start off with a question that we received from one of the participants. Today, most customers we work with will not pay more for a green solution. It may be the tiebreaker in the decision-making process if performance and value or cost are equal. Where does the GC3 agenda fit into this? And will this be policy-driven, or how do you address this concern? I know, Bob, you addressed this a little bit. Can you talk about that? And then Babette?
Well, I think one of the things we need to think about is what is the level of urgency around mainstreaming green chemistry, number one, and if it isn't there, why do we need to create it? And I would say that we do need to create it. And if we're going to create it, again, my thought is there needs to be this holistic approach to it, which includes how do we promote that level of urgency? What type of incentives can we have at the government level? What kind of collaborations can we have throughout all the stakeholders, particularly the NGO community? What consensus and alignment can we get on the problem that we're looking to solve or the innovation that has been created? And let's make sure we're communicating it in a way that clearly highlights the value that this innovation brings. And if it costs more than the existing, what are the advantages to anyone in the supply chain all the way through into the end user consumer?
Great. Babette, what's your thinking on that question? I know BioAmber has run into this challenge with some of its chemistries.
Yes, I mean, obviously economics are an important part of a decision to purchase, as much, if not more so in some cases, than our performance of the product and sustainability. And that's why we did move so fast to get to commercial scale, to get the economics that we felt were needed for commercialization. Having said that, going back to something that was said earlier, green chemistry is like every other chemistry in the sense that when you start out with a new product, you obviously have limited capacity in the industry. I mean, we've built 30,000 tons of biosuccinic acid. That's significant, but we hope that there will be many more green chemistry plants coming up all over the world to build the economies of scale that will be needed to mainstream green chemistry. So while there is going to be a period where we don't have globally the economies of scale for green chemistry, we do hope, coming back to what Bob said about Valspar, that these new innovations will pay for themselves in time. And if you bring the green chemistry into the formulations and the labs from the start, you will come up with the right combination for your company and for your product in terms of economics, performance, and sustainability.
Joel, may I just add something? We discussed this as a barrier in the agenda, and I think one of the things that the strategies that can address this are partnership building, so fostering these collaborations so that we can figure out how to share costs and risks among the supply chain to help get some of these new innovations to market.
Great. Thank you, Amy. This is almost a follow-on to the previous question. In some ways, climate change won't be a barrier until this externalized cost is internalized to become part of the cost of raw materials. How important do you see this factor, and how do you see governments driving it in light of the recent Paris Agreement? And maybe we should start with you, Babette, with that question.
So I'll perhaps start with the end of your question before we get to the beginning. The Paris meeting, we feel, contributed to overall awareness. Again, it's only a step along the path. You know, BioAmber committed with other US companies to the climate change pledge. Industry contributes about 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions globally, so that's quite a significant role. So we need that. We need more of that, and we certainly do need more policies that favor more sustainable chemicals. I'll go along with what Bob said earlier in a more holistic, positive way to help companies like ours producing these chemicals to move faster and gain traction.
Great. Bob, and you have an overall sustainability role. How do you see this connection between climate, green chemistry, sustainability, and this internalization of cost?
I think that, you know, clearly there are very few, I'll just say, entities that can simply do it and be successful doing it on their own. There are certainly examples of that, but again, we're here talking about mainstreaming, and I think until we have some sort of framework that hits on all of the elements that are in our agenda in a holistic way, it's still going to be very hard. It's still going to be very difficult because of the barriers that we've identified. So we need to think about it a little differently. We need to think about it more broadly, and you know, it's going to be hard to change that very quickly unless you got a group of stakeholders all on board thinking the same way and capitalize on the common goals as opposed to you know, some of the ways we do things today, which is, you know, sometimes a little less collaborative than it ought to be.
Great, thanks. And just so participants on the call know, we are planning at the GC3 Innovators Roundtable this year, which is taking place May 24th to 26th, hosted by 7th Generation Burlington, Vermont. We will be organizing a panel around the connection between green chemistry, climate change, and the circular economy to start exploring some of these questions in greater detail. Let me ask a question and follow up to a point that Babette mentioned about ensuring demand. You had mentioned we need to ensure that the demands for greener chemicals get transferred down and up the value chain. How do we make this happen? What are the strategies we could be employing to increase this type of communication up and down the supply chain to ensure that the raw materials manufacturers understand that demand, and that those who are seeing the demands firsthand can make sure that those who are making the chemistries know that the demand is there?
Joel, was that a question for me?
Yeah, I guess we could start with you, Babette, and then ask others. Obviously, you're at the beginning of the supply chain. Bob is in the middle of the supply chain, and so it goes both ways.
Well, I think it comes back to the points that were made by yourself and Amy earlier on. You know, we partner across the value chain to try and bridge the gap that there is there. Again, the challenge is that we're right at the very beginning, and as you saw, there are many levels there to get through to the end. Communication helps that. You know, the informing the marketplace, which is one of the goals here with the agenda, but not just the marketplace, also the educators and the policymakers, so that there's influence across that value chain. Bob, perhaps your comments from your perspective.
Well, if I think about the work that we did together, Babette, I come to the fact that you brought, or BioAmber brought a value proposition that was well communicated in terms of the value and the value to us in an area that was important to us. It made for a natural progression of us wanting to work together. And you know, maybe communicated in a less successful way, it could have easily been glossed over because it might have even easily been something that it's, well, okay, here's another company with some, you know, quote-unquote sustainable solution, and we've seen 100 like it. but there was a resonation in the communication of what you brought to the table that was of value to us, and at least at the very first steps, that's critically important because otherwise they do get glossed over.
Great, thank you, Bob. I'll start with Amy on this one. How can the GC3 better recognize and support early adopters of green chemistry solutions?
That's a good question. I think one of them is that these companies need to make themselves known to us, and you know, by doing so, then we can understand what they're doing, what their needs are. And over, the GC3 through the roundtable and its other programming has really excelled at creating partnerships that can connect people. So I would say, you know, one of the ways we can do it, if we know about these companies, we can connect them with our members, we can get them involved in our projects. So I don't mean to just make that a plug for the GC3, but I do think that we have proven that we can help out companies in this way, and we would love to work with these kinds of startups and help foster these collaborations and partnerships.
Great. Bob and Babette, what are your thinking? You know, what's the best way to recognize and support innovators who are really moving the marketplace?
Perhaps I'll have a stab at that first. I think coming back to what both you and Amy have said, it's creating the framework like the GC3 where small companies like ourselves can connect with companies across the value chain. I know it sounds oversimple, but it's very effective for companies like ourselves of our size, because we go to these events, we were able to hopefully contribute a little bit, certainly learn a great deal, and meet with the people that are participating in the supply chain all the way through to the brands and to the retailers. And that's very valuable. For us to do that without that framework is just much more difficult and takes more time.
Great. And we're winding up on our time here, so let me ask a final question here. When you mentioned the Ask the Innovators thing, oh, hold on here, last question. Are there entities or organizations that don't know their stakeholders in green chemistry, and how do we engage them more effectively, where they may be important in here, but they haven't really been part of the puzzle? And we'll start with you, Amy, and then we'll go down the line.
I actually was going to say that that's a question for Bob, because I really think that touches on what Bob was bringing up in his presentation, that we need to identify the stakeholders. And I guess briefly, it's by working with the stakeholders we already work with, and then perhaps asking them who else should be involved too. And it probably will depend project by project who gets involved. But I'd love to turn that one over to Bob.
Gee, thanks. I guess, you know, it's just hit on some of the obvious ones. You know, if we think about the government or a government at any level, you know, what is their role in green chemistry today? How do they use it? And maybe more importantly, what could it be? And what could it be more proactively? And that's where I think a lot of the thinking can come into play by members of the GC3 is, you know, we've talked a lot about incentives, subsidies, tax credits, expedited review and regulatory registrations and TSCA and things of that sort. Well, you know, let's formalize that. At the NGO level, how are NGOs typically acting today, and what would be ideal? And I think we have to start thinking about those ideal scenarios, not just on a stakeholder by stakeholder, but then take it into this more holistic, put all the stakeholders together. And what does that now mean? If they're all thinking in this idealistic way, how can we come together around consensus and alignment on everything, from what the priorities need to be to how they get communicated, so that it is seen as a positive thing for all.
Great. Thank you, Bob. With that, I'm going to wrap up the webinar. Some upcoming GC3 events. If you go to greenchemistryportal.com, that's our green chemistry portal that we coordinate with the American Chemical Society. We have an upcoming portal Ask the Innovator series called How Green is Your Raincoat, which will focus on durable water repellents, a very topical issue, and that takes place on Wednesday from 11:30 to 1. If you go to greenchemistryportal.org, you can join that conversation through the ACS blogs website, and you need to set up an account with the ACS blogs, which is free. And lastly, our GC3 Innovators Roundtable is taking place from May 24th to 26th, hosted by 7th Generation in Burlington, Vermont. Registration materials for GC3 members will be available shortly, as well as an initial agenda for the roundtable. And with that, I'd like to thank our three speakers, Amy Perlmutter, Bob Israel, and Babette Pettersen, for joining us on today's webinar. Today's webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the GC3 website. And thank you all, and have a pleasant afternoon.